Hey everyone, Avatar Guy here. Today we're going to talk about a piece of Avatar lore and history that I'm not sure how many people are familiar with it, but I just thought was interesting and thought I would cover. It's these. They're Avatar The High Ground books. They originally came in 3 volumes. These were also released as a huge library book, so you can, if you want, you can get them all in one single volume. It runs about 100, 200 pages in total. It's known as Avatar The High Ground, otherwise known as Avatar 1.5. And the reason for that is because it's based on a script that James Cameron originally wrote for an Avatar sequel. I would say that it's an interesting part of Avatar lore or of the Avatar franchise. It's certainly not my favorite, and I'm going to go into some detail about that and just the story in general. So if you don't want spoilers, now is the time to stop. The history of The High Ground, it was that James Cameron wrote a screenplay that he initially thought could be the sequel to Avatar, and said actually after writing it, it doesn't have certain elements that people expect of an Avatar movie, such as it doesn't have enough spirituality, it's too heroic, it doesn't have the big family themes that they always talk about, things like that. So he decided not to do that. They went back to the drawing board, took some elements from it and included those in Avatar 2, and then he handed this screenplay, which was completed, 130-page screenplay, to Sherry L. Smith, who is the person who adapted these books into a comic form. This is where it gets interesting, I think, is that there are obvious reasons that we already know when we approach these, it wasn't made into a movie. They're supposed to be canon. Now, if you've already watched my interview with Joshua Izzo, he very clearly states that there are 2 kinds of canon in the Avatar universe. There's the movie canon, and then there's everything else canon. And then there's some things that are not canon. And I would say that these definitely fall into the everything else canon, because there are certain things inside it that don't really make sense when you're watching the movie. So just from that point, I'll give you a very brief story overview. I don't want to spoil it too much. The story basically goes that it's very much similar to Avatar 2 that you see in the movie. We're introduced to all those characters, the Sully family. They're all the same Sully characters that we meet: Tuk, Neteyam, Loak, Kiri, Spider. What's missing is Kiri doesn't explicitly have a connection to Grace in this version. She's just said to be a war orphan from the aftermath of the war that we saw in the original Avatar. Spider also has a family that's on the base, and we get at the very beginning Jake talking about the world that he's given up, that not a day goes by where he doesn't feel something, a grievance, about the things that we saw in Avatar. We also see a couple of interesting points in the first volume where someone explicitly states that Jake didn't beat the RDA in the original movie, that Awa is the one who beat the original movie. We also have a very interesting moment between Jake and Neytiri where they're talking about the children, and Neytiri makes a comment about Na'vi children, comparing them to Loak, and Jake turns and says, well, isn't Loak Na'vi? What's Loak? So it almost gives away this notion that I think we'll probably see more of in Avatar 3, that Neytiri really doesn't see her children as Na'vi, or at least not intuitively, which I thought was interesting as well. At the end of Volume 1, or throughout Volume 1, we see the RDA return, and it's a little different actually than what we see in the movie, in that the RDA return with all the ISVs, but they don't immediately land, and this is where it gets a bit crazy. We have, this Volume 2 where, and it's personally, I agree with people who've made it, is that you end up with this, where that is a Na'vi in a spacesuit with a gun, and that they've all been training to go into space, that Jake talks about this, that they're going into space, and they're going to basically do a suicide mission against the RDA to take over one of the ISVs that has returned and attack the others and destroy them. At the same time, on the ground, the children are captured and taken to Hell's Gate, and it goes much more into Hell's Gate here, that Hell's Gate is still full of the RDA, still got everyone on board. It's a place where the humans are all basically hanging out, and that stops the suicide mission basically. That they have the children, that Jake and Neytiri were seeming to willing to want to die, but Neteyam being on board, the children being captured, and there being basically a revolution at Hell's Gate, that Jake has some of the humans at Hell's Gate on side, and they say we'll blow up all of Hell's Gate if you don't surrender. And then some other humans basically stage a coup against these humans who are on Jake's side and say, we're not going to do that, let the RDA come down. And then Jake and Neytiri give up on this suicide mission. And it basically is seen as that, which is crazy to me. That Jake and Neytiri would, sacrifice themselves so openly for that. And then also that Navi going into space, which I think is kind of absurd. It doesn't feel right to me. It's so strange. Like Navi is such intrinsic aspects of Pandora, and humans are the spacefaring group in Avatar. So that for me was just very, very strange. And then the final volume, which is the shortest of the three, the first two volumes are about 90 pages. The final section is them escaping from space with Valkyrie, and then the other Valkyries coming in and chasing them. And there's like robot drones chasing them through the woods and things like that. We see a lot of like cool RDA tech. And then they kind of crash land, they survive. A huge shark, a Akula, comes out of the sea, and it ends there. I think that if James Cameron had released this as the sequel to Avatar, I think his gut instinct was right. It just didn't. There's some really key elements missing from the entire thing. It wouldn't feel like a James Cameron movie even reading it. It doesn't feel that way. There's no obvious bad guy. Francis Ardmore is in it. It's Jake being a hero, Jake and Neytiri being a hero again, and it just doesn't really hit all of the big points that the original movie hit. And I think that Avatar: The Way of Water is vastly better for it. That doesn't mean that there aren't good elements. There's good bits where Neytiri does the same speech where she says that this family isn't a squad, which it obviously makes it into the movie. So there are elements of this script that make it into the actual movie, which I think are super interesting. But most of it is just, I think, doesn't feel very thought out, and all my own favorite elements of Avatar 2 are kind of missing here. And you can tell that it was written early on. There's no recoms, so recoms don't exist. Quaritch doesn't exist because there's no recoms. Quaritch doesn't exist really in any form. It's just Francis Ardmore. She's the one who's telling them from space, we want this and we want that. No Grace. So no explicit reference to Kiri's connection to her. Kiri doesn't get any cool moments where she's, sort of manifests Awa-like powers. There's no new cultures, explored. There is the ending where they land in the sea, and it's, that they've landed on a reef, which could mean that it opens it up for this new place that they've encountered. But there's none of that really in this, which is again a huge selling point of The Way of Water, which really doesn't appear here. The art style, which is one of the things that has been criticised the most by, I think, people who read it, is really all over the place. I, frankly, was quite shocked by the fact that the art style is so inconsistent. And I know that it's a huge project with lots of different people, so I get that. But in just some places, you just kind of think, this is $1 billion franchise. How did this pass quality control? The characters don't look like they should in any meaningful way. And the bits in space, I really struggled to understand what was going on. It was kind of all over the place. I can't imagine this translating from a James Cameron movie where the action is always very clear and crisp and you really do understand what's going on. It just doesn't feel that way with the comic. I think that overall, it's a very interesting thing if you're an Avatar fan to look at it based on thinking of it from a James Cameron as an author's perspective. I would really actually love to see the script of this published, to see how the script was written. Maybe it's got too many spoilers in, and that's why we didn't get the script. Or maybe they just didn't think that a script alone would have been as saleable as a comic. But no, so my overall, I think review is, it's an interesting piece of Avatar lore. It's not movie canon to me. It never will be. I don't want to watch an Avatar movie where Jake and Neytiri have been to space. I find it difficult watching an Avatar movie thinking that Jake and Neytiri have been into space. That just doesn't sit right with me. Jake, yes, but Neytiri, I'm not sure. At least not the way it's done here as well, where they're in spacesuits, and it's difficult to explain, but there's something extremely uncanny about it. I think as a fan, when you read it from that perspective of, okay, this was written before James Cameron really, really had a strong idea of what the sequels were going to be and where they were going to go, and look at it at that, look at it as what is missing, what don't we have, what has been obviously brought in later. That for me is how it's really interesting as a piece of Avatar merchandise, or a piece of broader Avatar universe material. That for me is where this really is valuable. It's not necessarily the deeper lore or anything like that, because like I said, I don't believe that it's any of those things on a really interesting level. I think like some of the other comics are a little bit more interesting in that regard, you know, like Adapt or Die. That I think is more in terms of exploring the world and like understanding it. I think that those are the ones that I really like it. So yeah, Avatar 1.5. I'm very, very glad that James Cameron didn't make this as a movie. It would have tested my resolve as a, you know, a fan of his, especially someone who's made, you know, Avatar. I mean, well, not just Avatar, Titanic, Terminator 2, Aliens, especially Terminator 2 and Aliens, in terms of being the sequel master. If this had come out as the sequel, I think that if this had stayed, it would have made it difficult to say that he's the undeniable master of sequels. But for most people, as they say in the kind of foreword, most directors, writers would have just had this because and then used it because they'd put so much effort into it. Instead, he saw that this was not what they wanted and made the bold and you know, decision to not use this. If you're a huge Avatar fan and you really do want to understand more of James Cameron's thought process during this period, definitely check it out. If you're a casual fan, I think the movies and maybe Adapt or Die, if you're going to pick up one of the comics, is really where you want to go. Otherwise, I would say it's a pass, but an interesting artifact nonetheless. So have you read The High Ground? Do you consider it, what level of canon do you consider it? What do you think of it? About the Na'vi in space, about the art, about James Cameron's writing style, even though this is obviously an adaptation? Let me know. I really do want to know, because, you know, I'm revisiting this since I got it back in 2022. Has made me take a more, like, I enjoyed it when it came out, but taking a more critical view of it there. As always, yeah, thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.